I'd like to actually quote here a Canadian general who was at our conference who mentioned that 80% of the capabilities is quasi-standard, off the shelf, if not commercial right now for what they need. And only 5% is a real sole sovereign capability in this. And the 15 in between is probably where you partner with other nations. So it's big time challenge to make sure that the commercial capability is available.
Hey, SpaceWatchers, and welcome back. A few weeks ago, we had the World Space Business Week in Paris, and one of the side events of the World Space Business Week was the SDSS, the Space Defense and Security Summit. And I have the great pleasure now to talk with one of the masterminds behind SDSS and one of the partners and the managing director of Novospace, Rainer Horn. Rainer, nice to have you back in our Space Café Radio.
Thank you, Thorsten, and it's a pleasure being part of the discussion with SpaceWatch.
In our morning show on the first day of SDSS, we had the pleasure to talk with you about your expectations, about the setup. And now let's dive in what happened during the very exciting 2 days. So we have seen your colleague, Anna Pokhauser, very comprehensive overview about the entire sector. So let's dive into that overview a bit from your point of view. So if you had to summarize her talk, her overview, and you take out just 3 takeaways for our listeners, what would they be?
The key themes that also were discussed extensively over the 2 days by military and civilian speakers here was the need for more international cooperation amongst allies and partners, and the fact that space security is no longer a theoretical but a clear operational challenge today, which also includes the interface to cyber protection, etc. And thirdly, I would say speed over quality. Your industry is seen as an enabler for speed and innovation in this activity.
Speed over quality, that's an interesting assessment. We had over the last decades a NASA administrator who said there is no failure on a zero failure tolerance. So how do we assess this speed over quality today?
Well, I think it's just a mere necessity. Since that event in Paris, we also had the major event in Berlin. You were there as well when the German Minister of Defense was explaining what the current situation is and what significant funds they're putting against it. It was clear that within a number of years they want to build space capabilities and they will have to make compromises. They will have not endless time to research new capabilities. They have to take a lot from stock. They have to work with technologies that is actually existing, and a lot of commercial capabilities will have to be deployed in a defense context.
That fits in tightly into my next thought, and that's the shift that we have seen in the last 24 months, even the last 12 months. So this shift in the burden of space defense, so moving towards deterrence and even offensive capabilities. And you mentioned our Minister of Defense, Boris Pistorius. He even spoke about offensive capabilities for Germany. But I think that's very provocative. So what does this shift actually mean for how nations think about space as a domain?
Yeah, I think space commanders were here quite vocal on stage and said, look, we need to not only defend ourselves, we have to be able to potentially attack or at least have the threat of attack. Otherwise, the deterrence might not be as effective as could be. I think it was actually first on radio in SpaceWatch.Global when a German commander, Major General Traut, was talking about shield and sword, taking an analogy from old Roman times when a gladiator would probably be not very effective if he only had a shield, if he didn't have a sword to actively defend himself.
That's an interesting shift of the narrative on how we see space today, isn't it?
Absolutely. Now, it's also being talked about at all the conferences, what certain countries are doing to observe very actively, at least, satellites. And if you want to do something about it, you might have to be able to fend them off one way or the other, or at least be able to have similar threat potential in your own arsenal.
Let's talk about space as in the playground, the congested orbit. so to say. So we are tracking today over 50,000 objects today, and there's a projection, what your colleague also described, of another 43,000 satellites by 2034. So how do you see the sheer scale of proliferation changing the rules of the game for space defense, plus put AI on it that they even self-detect?
We clearly see, and that's actually mimicked by the discussion that we've witnessed in Paris, there's a clear action for more common language on what is currently called SSA, SDA, Space Domain Awareness, Space Situational Awareness, and so forth. I think all the actors have to convene to a more common language to not misunderstand themselves in the future. But also, governments need to optimize launch, collision on launch assessments, and the LEOPS, the launch and early operations, for which governments are looking to commercialize their capabilities. I think we have also to look at how governments will become ready for using commercial operators. Governmental players, being civilian or military, will have to embrace commercial sensors as they're being rolled out by industry. We see new RF sensors, we see new radars, we see new optical sensors all being integrated and using AI to power them all and to make sense out of them, both for optimizing the orbits, avoiding collision, but also knowing where suspicious activity in orbit is happening at the moment.
So can you shed some light where we stand on that? Because talking with EUSST that we have here in Europe, or even talking with the German Space Command, it seems that the objects that we can track today are very limited. And we're focusing, obviously, of the assets that we or our allies own. But there's this huge unknown. And with the scale up, so how can we, or what would be a scenario to deal with this massive growth? You, from the Novaspace point of view, are a consulting company, you are a think tank having some foresight in this specific area. So maybe you can share a few of them with us.
The capability of these sensors is getting bigger and is improving all the time. Yeah, there are some providers worldwide who claim they can already see debris or space objects smaller than 2 or 3 centimeters. Yes. To what extent they can be efficiently logged, categorized, cataloged, and so forth is a different story. But at least their mere existence in a certain orbit is something that they will be able to map. We will probably see that for certain orbits, there will be something like a digital twin out there, where dynamically one can see where is a dust cloud or a debris cloud moving, where are there major activities to enable launch or to possibly prevent a launch window at a certain point where you don't want to get into trouble.
Let's talk about the areas and the economics of space defense or defense space. For me, the numbers that were presented were new, and it was interesting to follow that by 2022, the 2 lines of civil and military spendings crossed each other already. And now in 2024, and these were the numbers that you presented, we talk about $73 billion spending on the military side versus the $62 billion on the civil side. Okay, we can take that because these are the numbers, but the prediction in the next 10 years go up to $200 billion by 2034 on the military spendings. So where are the hotspots of this growth? And we just spoke about SSA, Space Situational Awareness, Space Domain Awareness, secure communication, monitoring constellations, on-orbit servicing, God knows what. Where do you see that?
Well, I guess in the very short term, we will see more and more constellations and secure constellations, domestically controlled constellations being launched from different actors. That will certainly help the growth. And that's for satellite communication, that will be for Earth observation, that might be constellations to have an alternative to the GNSS systems already, to have more resilience when it comes to being prone to jamming and spoofing. In addition, you will see possibly the first activities for in-orbit refueling, enabling a space economy or space activity by military players. If there were to be some laser guns up there, you would eventually have to repower them very quickly. You cannot wait until the solar cells recharge huge batteries. You might have to have different means of propelling certain activities up there. We believe there's quite a big uptake to come in that regard, looking at spacecraft and spacecraft capabilities that are currently often still seen a bit in the sci-fi region.
Yeah, it sounds so, because we have seen over the last years on-orbit servicing activities already in a very small scale, no doubt. What is next? On-orbit manufacturing or recycling, as many say, that we are not throwing our orbital assets back to Earth, but let's see how that will go.
But also, I think there will be an element of earthly industrialization of space. Yeah, I think finally we will see demands for new spacecraft that is not just from a civilian new space arena, but also multiple satellites to be developed in a very short period of time. So industrial scaling will be at least as important as the technology itself.
Rapid response is something you are referring to, or?
Number one is to build the constellations that are earmarked at the moment in time. That means you have to look at differently. You cannot do just single satellites and produce them by very gifted scientists and engineers, but you have to have a more industrial approach to it going forward, at least larger batch productions, having the spare parts, having the parts already ready to go and not just order them when you put the satellite together. And of course, responsive space is also something where you need to say, where do I want to have which capability ready to be reactive enough to launch it on a ready-to-go spacecraft?
But you mentioned a very crucial point in this entire scenario, and that's launcher capabilities. When we talk about constellations, for nation states, for Europe, we need launchers, and you want to launch them with your own launchers, obviously. And that's one of the big issues that we have here in Europe, that we don't have the large launchers available, unfortunately. Do you see that as a big threat, or will we solve that as we go?
I mean, there's a number of companies in the starting blocks on the launch pads, and we will see some more launches still this year. Players that will eventually probably develop way beyond the micro launcher size. They have bigger ambitions to build bigger rockets in the future, at least some of them. So I believe the bottleneck will eventually be closed. But in the very short term, we might have a bit of an issue, yes.
You mentioned in your findings the civil-military integration as one of the points, as a takeaway. How can we, commercial and civil assets, integrate into defense architecture? So how realistic is that? There's a necessity, but how realistic is that? And on what levels? Are the governments, are the militaries ready to trust commercial providers in such a sensitive domain?
Well, I'd like to actually quote here a Canadian general who was at our conference, who mentioned that 80% of the capabilities is quasi-standard, off the shelf, if not commercial right now for what they need. And only 5% is a real sole sovereign capability in this. Yeah, and the 15 in between is probably where you partner with other nations. So it's big time challenge to make sure that the commercial capability is available, that within friendships, within partnerships, within the allied nations, the procedures are there, that export control is not an unnecessary bureaucracy for that. Now we see that NATO has launched their commercial space strategy recently. They have integration cells where they embrace industrial capability, test out several of them in parallel, and try to build industry solutions for their needs. Yeah. Now, the other topic is on the pure contractual side. The commercial agreements, they need to last not only in peacetime, but also in crisis and in a real conflict. But that is currently being worked on, and we've seen it, NATO bring it forward in their upcoming implementation plan.
An interesting thought on that. A German general last year said in one of the conferences that in a conflict time, or even further in a war time, so what access do you have to the people that work in the company? that are involved in such a scenario. So they are not reservists. They might be even not holding a national passport of this country we are talking about. And that can be quite a very tricky question. But as you mentioned before, I'm reminded of this statement of buy what you can and build what you need. So really to focus on the sensitive stuff that you need. And we talk, and that was presented to me with great interest. It was that today we have 54 countries now active in space defense out of the 100 countries that are doing this commercial or exploratory space. So it's tripled. The numbers are from just 2 years ago. What risks do you see coming with that development? Many of them are having really a national, sometimes even a nationalistic approach also to space.
Well, I think you have different factors. Some that are really seeing a clear threat, and they would like to see maybe from the ground of who's watching them, who's watching their critical infrastructure. You have others who possibly justify space activities also with some national interest. An observation satellite needs to show that it does something for your country. The defense angle is being built in from the start. And nowadays, budgets are probably easier secured with a defense angle than with a pure environmental touch. So I think you have to bring all these different factors together. When we are working with national governments around the world, helping them building space strategies, more often than not, the angle of security is to be touched upon. Within limits, of course, because we might not have the access to the security information that is required. But we can give some generic guidance of which technologies are suitable for a defense purpose and which ones not.
And are the military and security clients that you had the opportunity to work with all well trained and up to standards, a technical standard as well? Did you say, hey, these guys really know what they want, or is it fishing a bit in the dark as well?
We're working on large, expensive programs. No, seriously, but we have a track record in supporting institutional, civilian, and military, and often hybrid space programs, and have helped our clients from the origination of the project to the specification, supporting the tender mechanism, all the way to observing the build, but also training the operators afterwards. So many of them are hybrid satellites that are maybe on a commercial spacecraft and have some extra sensors for military purpose. So yes, we are helping different countries to build space capabilities, and that's also a capability that we think is fairly unique that we see to be used very soon also in Europe more often.
With all your studies and with all your knowledge in that sector, if you had to place a bet, what will be the biggest disruptor in space defense in the next 5 years? Just 5 years. These are the 5 years that our Minister of Defense put out the 35 billion or so by 2030. Are these, again, LEO constellations? Is it AI? Is it autonomy? Or with that, is it geospatial, geopolitics, all of the above?
I might disappoint you, but I think the technical side of things is probably going to be solved. But I think on the institutional side, you will have a bottleneck in making the procurement processes work in time and having the right talent on board to execute both the procurement processes, but also later in operating those new spacecraft under guidance of real military staff. And I would assume that many military institutions will adopt more civilian procurement practices in this and be more open to cross-border supply chains amongst allies and partners, because the pure national supply chain cannot be secured in too many countries in this world.
So you see the procurement, and we're not just talking here about Germany, we talk globally, is an issue as well as a human factor?
Absolutely, yes. We see some countries who have expedited procurement processes, made it more standard, but also found very creative ways around it that will permeate others, yes. But government regulation behind procurement has to be challenged here and there. And I think the need, the urgency of 2029, 2030 will force us to think more creatively about it.
Rainer, let's try to close on a more personal level. We see these challenges and threats and the growing demand for the defense space sector. What gives you hope in this contested domains? And on the other side, what keeps you awake at night?
I'm just from the experience that we had, both last being in the same room with the defense minister just a few days ago in Berlin, that gives us a good hope that something is moving forward. Having observed how a military is convening to one opinion and culminating in a speech like that is very promising, that people who have not been looking at space too seriously a few years ago, how quickly they have come together and developed a strategy and the budgets behind it, that gives me quite a bit of hope that we're on a good path.
Interesting. So you don't have any concerns, because in the German example, the 35 billion divided by 5 years, 7 billion is the spending, what is a bit lower, but in the same order of magnitude than the ESA spending.
Absolutely. I think the concern will be how much can we deliver of that in that period of time. It's certainly a stretch of what the industry is able to do. But coming back to points I made earlier is we're now being forced to think industrially about solution. We cannot build single-purpose, one-time satellites and throw away the tools if we ever had any. We have to think about solutions that can be multiplied.
Rainer, thank you very much for your time. And we will potentially discuss this topic more over the years to come, I'm quite sure.
Thank you.
And if you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.